Okay, our presentation tonight is Western Monarchs, a holistic view of recent history, ecology, resilience, and adaptation to a changing climate. Our speaker is Dr. David James, and he began his entomological career as an 8-year-old in England by rearing caterpillars at home. A university degree in zoology was followed by a PhD on monarch butterfly biology in Sydney, Australia, where he worked for 23 years as an agricultural entomologist for the New South Wales government. He moved to Washington State University in 1999 and has been developing biological control systems for grapes and hops, but he never forgot his butterfly roots. So in 2011, he co-authored with Dave Nunnally a book called Life Histories of Cascadia Butterflies, and he has conducted monarch tagging studies in the Pacific Northwest since 2012. And that work has defined monarch migration in this region. His deep experience in many aspects of monarch biology providing him with a much more optimistic view of monarch population persistence than many of his contemporaries, and he'll speak about that tonight. So thank you for being with us tonight, David.
Thank you very much, Paulette, for that introduction. Okay, so here we go again. I was just mentioning that I gave a presentation on the monarch exactly a year ago, but so much happens in the monarch world that you literally can present different presentations on the monarch on an annual basis, I think. So much research is being done and so many things are happening in the monarch world. So what I'm going to present tonight is actually a modified version of something I presented to the recent Monarch Summit that was held in California. It was a keynote address that tried to present, as the title says, a more holistic view of the monarch in all aspects. And tonight I'll talk about the recent history, the history that we know of the monarch butterfly, that is, the ecology, its resilience and recent apparent adaptation to a changing climate. Looking at these things from a holistic view. Too often I find in the monarch world anyway, there's a lot of research being done on monarchs, and researchers tend to talk about and focus on just their research area without a view to, seeing how it fits into the whole picture of monarch ecology. And I think that's important to do. But first, we should talk about celebration. The monarchs have risen from the dead. In fact, my talk last year was something like the death of the monarch is over exaggerated or something else. And sure enough, I mean, that was based on 1 year's rebound. We now have 2 years rebound. And so the population, the overwintering population, which is the only way that we can measure the population by counting numbers at the overwintering colonies, citizen scientists do this and have been doing this since '97. So that has shown that we've rebounded this year up to 335,479 butterflies from 1899 in 2020. So that's a 170-fold increase, which is quite remarkable and has really surprised everybody, except me, perhaps. I wasn't surprised about the rebound, but maybe the magnitude of it did surprise me. I never doubted that they were going to rebound because, as you'll hear, and you've probably heard a bit of this before, with my experience of monarch biology in the past, I knew that they were very adaptable and resilient. And when the monarch population was at its lowest in 2020, I actually put this view into print, had a paper published in a journal called Animal Migration, where I presented a more optimistic view of what was happening, what was going on. I mean, already in winter 2020, we had an inkling that things were changing in the ecology of the butterfly. It appeared that many of them were breeding in California during the winter instead of overwintering in non-reproductive colonies. And so I expounded on that in this paper here, and was, considered Pollyanna for presenting a view that was probably overly optimistic. So I was fortunate in the end to be optimism. And the reason I had this optimism was that because it was the sense of deja vu that I had. I studied, as you heard in the opening, I studied monarch biology in Australia during the late 70s and early 80s. And my PhD was the overwintering biology of the monarch butterfly in Sydney, New South Wales. And as part of that, I discovered a new strategy of winter breeding of monarchs during the winter, and this followed an a population decline of about 90% prior to my work, between 64 and 78. So, that is exactly what has happened in Western US. We had this major decline, as I'll talk more about in a minute, and then a new strategy of winter breeding. At the time in Australia, I thought it was more to do with a lack of habitat that caused the decline. But in retrospect, there may have been a climate influence too. I mean, I didn't look at climate data at that time, but that may have figured in the whole transition as well. So how did we get here with the monarch populations? I just got to go briefly, try and go pretty quickly, because I've spoken about some of this, a lot of this before, but it's sort of more crystallized now in my mind. We're
having a little bit of trouble with some lag. Could you just go back about 30 seconds?
About how many seconds?
30.
30 seconds. So how did we get here? What are the major causes of long-term monarch decline in the West? Are you hearing me okay now?
Yeah, it's fine now.
Okay. So this graph presents the estimates or counts of Western monarchs from the 1980s right through to, on this graph, to just beyond 2015. And there's a big difference, as you can see, from the early part to the latter part. And in the early part, they were estimates. We didn't have the formal Thanksgiving count that we do have now, that was introduced in 1997, where, as I briefly mentioned before, it's done every Thanksgiving by citizen scientists, and they get a count, which is still an estimate because it's very difficult to count every single butterfly, but it's a much better estimate than prior to 97. But the estimates that we do have, and this graph is lifted from Cheryl Schultz's recent paper, suggests that populations were greater than about 600,000 for 12 to 17 years prior to 1997. And some, estimates put the population, about between 1 and 4 million. And then in 1997, as I said, we had the Thanksgiving counts, and we had this big drop. You can see there in the center of the graph, this drop from, got something obscuring my dates here. It was 97, and then 98 and 99, the population went down to about 200 to 300,000. And it's sort of been there ever since, well, up until 2017. And so this shows that latter part of that graph better. This graph represents the Thanksgiving counts from 97 onwards. The straight line is the number of participants in the count. So you can ignore that, except to realize that participation's increased greatly in recent years. And so you can see there was a major decline around the turn of the century, and thereafter it's been up and down, but it hasn't gone too far one way or the other. There've been, some periods where it's got very low and some periods where it's done pretty well. And then later, other things have happened that I'll talk about more in a minute. So that was 25 years of populations around 200 to 300,000. So what caused that big decline from millions to 200,000 to 300,000? Well, my prime number one suspect is the rise of neonicotinoid insecticides. And again, I've spoken about these before, and I've spoken about this for a long time, and so I recently went back to check the literature and see what was new in the world of neonicotinoid research, and I was quite amazed and staggered really by how much work is being done on them and how much the bad news has continued. Literally there are papers being published every week on the impact of neonicotinoids, not only on insects but also vertebrates, including ourselves. And so I'm more alarmed about neonicotinoid insecticides than I have been. This graph just shows the rise of neonicotinoids, which occurred after 1997. So it fits the same timeline as the decline in monarch populations, not only in the West, but in the Eastern US too. There's, as I said, there's much work being done on neonicotinoids. I just mentioned some briefly that concern with butterflies. There are faunal studies that show an association between butterfly population declines and increased neonicotinoid use, both in the UK and also in California. That those by themselves don't prove that it's neonicotinoids, but there's an association there, which is suggestive. Lab studies are lagging behind, particularly with butterflies. There's a lot of work being done on bees, mostly honeybees, unfortunately, but increasingly now native solitary bees are also being examined, and other insects as well. And so, the cabbage white butterfly in England has been looked at, and there are impacts on the caterpillars caused by imidacloprid, which is a neonicotinoid. So there's important to realize that there are lethal and sublethal effects, and it's the sublethal effects that seem to be the most important in terms of long-term impacts. I've mentioned this before, the short study that I did in 2019, which basically I fed monarch butterflies after emergence with a field realistic level of contaminated sugar solution, and basically, most of the butterflies died after 3 weeks, and at higher rates have got 100% mortality in a shorter frame of time. So, although it appears that a field realistic dose of contaminated food, and we know that nectar in wild plants near agricultural fields and maybe away from agricultural fields do contain neonicotinoid residues, and so this level is based on that work. And so those sort of levels, while not killing the butterfly immediately, a monarch immediately, will actually reduce its longevity, which of course has major implications in the long term for generations, for the development of generations. If fecundity is reduced because the butterflies don't live as long, then population's not going to do as well. And this, what's happened in this study of the monarch, it may be happening in other butterflies too. And of course, it's not just through nectar that they could be receiving neonicotinoid. Caterpillars could be feeding on neonicotinoid contaminated plants, and work has been done on caterpillars, and larval exposure does result in developmental problems. Again, not outright mortality, but problems, increasing the period of development, and particularly pupal ecdysis, the change of caterpillars into pupae, seems to be a major feature of neonicotinoid contamination, not only in the monarch, but other butterflies too. So there's a lot we don't know, but the little bits that we are beginning to learn do not bode well. One of the one of the things, well, when I made this slide we didn't really know how widespread neonicotinoid contamination is. There's now been a number of studies that sort of indicated my worst fears that it is widespread. We know that it's very soluble in water. It's very long-lived. One of the principal neonicotinoids has been shown to have a half-life of 39 years, I think it was, or maybe it's 19, many years anyway. And most of the neonicotinoids have half-lives of at least a year or two. And that's, substantial, which means that if it, matched with its solubility in water, it can get into our streams and water supplies. Most neonicotinoids are applied in agricultural regions, but it doesn't mean to say that they're going to stay there. And actually, most neonicotinoids, in terms of quantity of active ingredient, are applied in urban areas. The rate of use in urban areas is greater than in agricultural areas. So that's a concern. And again, this is a slide I made up some time ago, but I've added extra bits through recent research that really is alarming in how widespread contamination of our surface waters are in the US, but also worldwide, in China in particular. Just a study I found this week found 50% of well water samples in Iowa contain neonicotinoids. It's also found in tap water, and treatment of tap water does not get rid of the neonicotinoids either. So it is very concerning, not just for the butterflies, but for us. And I have an awful feeling that in the future we'll look back on the neonicotinoid era as being equivalent perhaps to the DDT era in the problems that it causes. So average levels of neonicotinoids in nectar, as I mentioned, in crops, they're the lowest application rate. So we find the lowest levels contamination in nectar. It's much higher in home gardens, as you can see, 5 to 7 times. But the greatest amounts found in nectar are the nectar in landscape trees and bushes, because of the amount that's pumped into those trees and bushes to kill borers or the other pests that they're designed for. Urban areas could be a major problem in terms of neonicotinoid contamination. And as far as I know, nobody has actually surveyed the extent of contamination of plants in urban areas. But as I say, I'm monitoring research as it comes out, and I'm betting that there'll be a study coming out very soon about that. So this is just neonicotinoids, and I've got to be in my bonnet about neonicotinoids, but there's many other types of pesticides, and importantly, mixtures. There's no way that we can learn about everything that pesticides are going to do in terms of sublethal effects, because nobody looks at mixtures, and sometimes they can, make things worse or make things better by mixing. There's new classes of insecticides that we have virtually no information. Now that neonicotinoids are under the microscope, so to speak, other groups of pesticides are being produced, and we have no information on them. To get a pesticide registered, you don't need to show wide, sublethal impacts on beneficial insects, for example. I mean, the most they might do is look at the impact on honeybees, since that, they are considered very important for agriculture, which they are. But, we know that many other beneficial insects might also suffer from these insecticides, and we don't have any information on that. So in summary, in the West and in the East, the increased use of neonicotinoids and other pesticides, and that's the other interesting thing, the amount of pesticides we're using has actually gone up in the last year. So even though we're reducing the amount of very harmful pesticides, the overall active ingredient amount has gone up. And I think this is the most likely to be the cause for the long-term, the post-1997 population decline. And, I've mentioned it many times before, but the eastern population of monarchs also declined at the same time. And so it seems likely that the same force was in progress. And of course, pesticides are everywhere over the continent. And so, habitat loss and climate change are two other factors that we consider are having an impact on monarch populations, but they wouldn't constitute such an abrupt change in the landscape as the introduction of these neonicotinoid pesticides did. So, I'm not a betting man, but if I was, I'd be betting for the neonicotinoids. But the bottom line is we need a lot more research on the impact of all pesticides on monarchs, not just direct toxicity, but a more demographic approach, incorporating sublethal effects, because that's exactly what DDT was about. It wasn't, it wasn't the direct toxicity of that material. It was the sublethal effects through all the things we know about, eggshell thinning, etc. So the neonicotinoids are very similar. And so we have these new chemical groups we need to look at as well.
David?
Yes.
Can I interrupt with a question?
Sure.
Question is, what does sublethal mean? Is it the same as chronic?
No, sublethal impacts are things that are not killing the insect immediately, but they are causing a reduction in fecundity or egg laying, perhaps, if we're talking about a butterfly, or a reduction in length of life. So it's not going to, immediately kill the butterfly when the insecticide touches it, but it's going to cause the butterfly to live a less productive life. So, and there's many other types of sublethal impacts, but it's things that have a population effect rather than an individuals are affected too, but the whole population is going to suffer because of the impact of the pesticide.
And another question, it seems like there's been a lot of interest in organic of every sort, for food, for home gardens, for everything. It's interesting that despite the increased interest in organic, that there's still serious problems. I assume that neonicotinoids are not permitted for organic
No.
growing. Is that right?
No, they're not. They're not organic at all. No. So yeah, organic is still increasing, but not at the level or the rate that many people anticipated. It's certainly a bigger component now than it was 20 years ago, but it's at this rate it will be another 100 years before it becomes the dominant part of the market. And most of that is because organic doesn't work in a lot of crops. I mean, there's certain crops that it will work in, but not across the board.
Right. And another question about pesticides. You say pesticides, are you mainly talking about insecticides or other things? And Regina points out that some organic pesticides, I'm guessing like pyrethrins, can be very toxic as well.
Yes, I'm mostly talking about insecticides, but there are fungicides and herbicides that do have sublethal effects too. And some organic materials, yes, can have impacts too.
Okay, Regina points out that organic fungicides are very toxic to bees. Okay, please continue, David.
Okay, so that's the neonicotinoids, I think, or pesticides generally were responsible for the big decline. But since then, we've had 16 years in the West of populations between 100,000 and 300,000. And then in 2018 and 2019, we had a huge drop, 85%, from 200,000 plus down to 30,000 in 2018. And then in 2020, as I said at the beginning, we had this incredible drop down to less than 2,000 butterflies at all the overwintering sites. So what happened at that time between November 2017 and November 2018 to cause the population to spiral down from 200,000 to 30,000? Well, the only thing that really of note seemed to have happened at that time were catastrophic storms in California, much as has occurred this past winter during January and March in both those years, 2018 and 2019, were just as almost just as bad as the storms we had this year. And they pummeled the overwintering populations. At this time, the overwintering populations are at their most vulnerable because their energy reserves are depleted. They've been there since October, and they're getting ready to leave, and they're most vulnerable. Their wings are a bit more damaged than they were before. And so this is the only thing that seemed to happen during those 2 years that might have caused a big reduction in population. But also at the same time, we had our first evidence from our tagging program that some Pacific Northwest migrant monarchs contributed to California winter breeding. We had 2 individuals that were tagged in the Pacific Northwest that were found in California actually in the act of laying eggs on milkweed. It was tropical milkweed in backyards in Santa Barbara and San Francisco. And so these individuals were bucking the trend. They weren't supposed to be doing that. They were supposed to be going to the overwintering sites and to remain in reproductive dormancy until February. But instead, in September, October, they decided to reproduce and lay eggs. And so, you know, I wrote a paper on this event at the time and wondered whether this was part of a bigger issue. You know, if we just found 2 of our tag population, which isn't very big in the scheme of things, if there was 2 there, how many would there be in the general population that were not becoming reproductive or not staying reproductively dormant and going to overwintering sites? For the butterflies to actually have got to California, they had to have been reproductively dormant in the first place when they left the Pacific Northwest. Migration only occurs in non-reproductive individuals. So it was once they reached California, San Francisco, Santa Barbara, that these females reverted or became reproductive. So was this a trend? It was almost like I was Nostradamus there, or these butterflies were predicting what was going to happen, because in fall 2020, something really different did happen. That was the first year that none of our Pacific Northwest tag butterflies were found at overwintering sites. Prior to that, in the 7 years before, 63% of all our recovered tags were at overwintering sites. We found the number that we would expect from 1,300 tagged butterflies, but they were all in Northern California or San Francisco basin area associated with milkweed. We didn't actually find any laying eggs, but they were, I think this one here was one of them just hanging out on milkweed. So hanging around the milkweed patch, looking like they were reproductive. So that made me wonder what was going on. And this was the year of COVID, of course, so I had plenty of time to look online at iNaturalist and so I looked at the January sightings of monarch larvae and pupae in the San Francisco Bay Area from 2015 onwards. And so this was January 2021. And you can see there from the graph that there was a big uptick in the number of larvae and pupae. Prior to that, there was a few, but not a significant number. And then all of a sudden, it became a significant number, up to I think about 60 sightings just in that month on iNaturalist too. There was no doubt that was just a snapshot of what was going on. So it did seem like there was a lot of winter breeding happening in San Francisco Bay Area that year. So looking back at what was different in that season during the autumn, during the migration, I looked at the temperatures there, the mean daily maximum temperatures for San Francisco during September, October 2020 was 75 degrees Fahrenheit, which was a record. That was the highest for that period ever recorded. And there were days when it was 100 degrees. So there was a lot of fires in that year too. And so it was an extremely, the migrants coming in from Pacific Northwest experienced very hot conditions when they arrived in San Francisco. And it appeared that a lot of these butterflies decided not to travel further and instead abandon reproductive dormancy and become reproductive. And, I had some earlier experience with monarchs breaking reproductive dormancy in Australia, where as part of my PhD work, I showed that the dormancy in monarchs there was not actually diapause, which is a very rigid, fixed dormancy. It was much more flexible in Australian monarchs, and it's easily broken. And we actually termed it oligopause. We didn't term it that. It's actually another form of dormancy that's more flexible. And the interesting thing is that we don't know what form the reproductive dormancy is in Western North American monarchs. So, dormancy could be more easily broken in the Western monarch than Eastern monarchs, for example. So all this happened at the one time during that winter, and I won't go into great detail about this, but we did a population study on winter breeding butterflies in the urban South Bay of San Francisco. I recruited some citizen scientists to help me there. And so we came up with the first paper on winter breeding, which showed that butterflies at one particular site, which happened to be Googleplex, which is a campus of Google that they actually developed a campus that is wildlife friendly. They aim to attract wildlife, and they certainly did a good job at providing milkweed for monarchs. So this was a mecca for monarchs in that year. There was a lot of adults there, between half and 1.5 butterflies seen per minute on a 30-minute survey all winter long. Plenty of larvae too. So it was demonstration that breeding was occurring at a high rate, a much higher rate than had ever been seen before in this particular winter. The same winter that less than 2,000 were at the overwintering population was recorded. So were these two things linked? That was the question. And I put this asterisk here, Paulette, in case people wanted to ask questions at this point. But since we've done that, we could go on, or we could have another question break.
Sorry, yes, we can go on.
Okay. So after that winter, 2021, we weren't expecting to see any monarchs in the Pacific Northwest in summer 2021, given that there was such a low overwintering population. I had different ideas, of course, because of the winter breeding that was going on. And there were also, populations in Arizona that year that were breeding. Anyway, it turned out that we had pretty decent populations in 2021. It wasn't brilliant. I can't remember the numbers now, but we may have seen a dozen butterflies that year compared to maybe just 2 the previous year. And so it wasn't worse, it was better, which surprised a lot of the people that they were able to show some kind of rebound. So all eyes were then fixed on looking at what would happen during the autumn in the Bay Area when the migrants were flying through. Were they going to experience hot, dry conditions again and be, coerced into reproducing? That didn't happen. As you can see, in 2021, the daily mean daily maximum temperatures in September, October were actually below the 15-year mean, which is the line across the middle there. So there was no temperature distraction for incoming monarchs in that particular season. So at that point, I was predicting a much larger population to occur overwintering than in the previous winter. And sure enough, that's what happened. We went up to 247,246, which blew everybody away. How could 1899 individuals create that population just in 1 year? I mean, mathematically, it wasn't possible for that small a population, 1899, which only 50% were females. It was mathematically impossible, biologically impossible for a population that high to be produced. So where did they come from? Well, as you probably guessed by now, my number one theory was the fact that the winter breeding populations contributed to that rebound. They were there. I mean, the population in California, if we could count the winter breeding populations in winter 2020, 21, if we could count the populations, the breeding populations, it probably would have been 300,000 as the previous year, or the long-term average. So that's what I think. But Chip Taylor, well-known monarch biologist, suggests that there may have been some unknown overwintering sites, and that's not impossible. They could have overwintered in smaller numbers, perhaps in the coastal range area, at sites that they don't usually occupy and have not been found. And then there's the possibility that the Western population gained help from the Eastern population by some overwintering individuals from Mexico being diverted west into California in the spring of 2021, and contributing to the breeding in the West during summer 2021. And this is an idea that's been kicked around for a while now by Lincoln Brow. It's originated by Lincoln Brow and Bob Pyle quite a while ago, 2004, I think. And it probably happens every year to a greater or lesser extent, but it's very difficult to measure and to know how. But it does seem to be something that does happen, and probably part of the long-term sustainability of Western monarch populations. So at this time, when it became obvious to everybody that winter breeding was occurring in California, a lot of people became very alarmed that if they can breed year-round in California, why do they need to migrate and leave? Will this mean the end of Western monarch migration? Which this idea was pretty foreign to me, given what I'd learned about monarchs in Australia and elsewhere. That's just not going to happen, because monarch behavior is based on physiology, and their physiology is based on responding to environmental cues, which, if you're breeding population in San Francisco Bay Area, you're still going to get the same environmental cues, i.e. day length change, sun angle at solar noon, and increase in temperature as any other butterfly on the landscape. And monarchs are adapted to respond to these cues, and these cues determine whether the population becomes reproductive or non-reproductive, migratory or non-migratory. So in the spring, increasing day length, as occurs in the spring, induces butterflies to become migratory. Spring migrants are not non-reproductive as the autumn migrants are, but they do migrate. So they travel north, and this is the reason why we get them in the Pacific Northwest, because they are responding to increasing day length. And once day length doesn't increase more than about 3 minutes a day, 2 or 3 minutes a day, then they stop migrating. So they have to have that. And so winter breeding populations in California would have responded to the same cues. So I'm confident that these butterflies, participated in the migration in 2021 and helped bolster the population to what we saw in 2021, the overwintering population. But again, this is an area that we don't know a great deal about for Western monarchs, and not even for Eastern US monarchs. I worked on it in Australian monarchs, and the butterflies in Australia, and this is a crux of a lot of what I'm talking about, is that Australian monarchs have adapted to the more benign environmental conditions there and have a different reproductive dormancy. I've already mentioned that it's more flexible, but the induction of reproductive dormancy appears to be different from Eastern US monarchs, in that most of the induction of dormancy and migration occurs after the butterfly has emerged. It's the conditions that a newly emerged butterfly experiences, and in this case, it's cool temperatures primarily for 2 to 4 days post-eclosion that determine if the monarch is going to become a migrant or non-migrant, and reproductive or non-reproductive. If it's cool, they become non-reproductive. And this is regardless of day length during larval development. In contrast, in the eastern US, Goering and Oberhauser in 2002 showed that declining day length and fluctuating temperatures during larval development caused induction of reproductive monarchs in the eastern US monarchs. They didn't look at effects of environment on newly emerged individuals, and I suspect that they would be affected in the same way. Declining day lengths would also induce dormancy. But as I say, we don't know. I mean, it's possible that Western monarchs respond in the same way, or maybe somewhere in between the Australian and the eastern monarchs. So that's one thing that we lack, that we don't know the exact cues and physiology of induction of reproductive dormancy. But one thing that I think is fairly certain is that whatever the cues are, and it's likely to be declining day lengths and low fluctuating temperatures, they're going to act upon all stages, not just the larvae and pupae, but also the newly eclosed adults. But as I say, we still need to do that work in the West. So, as I said, based on physiology, there's no reason that why California winter breeding populations in March and April 2021 did not respond to the seasonal conditions and become migratory and help form the good summer populations. So this is the idea that Chip Taylor has about possibly using other overwintering sites. And there is some precedent for this, even with my Australian work, that showed that exceptionally high temperatures will sometimes allow monarch butterflies to conserve their energy reserves. And so it is possible that, we've actually seen, and Chip Taylor's seen, clustering of butterflies when it's extremely hot, above 95, 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Monarchs will sometimes roost in the shade because they're conserving their fat. So it is possible that some did overwinter in the Bay Area that winter at sites that weren't found, and presumably in very low numbers too, otherwise they would have been seen. So reiterating, I think, the missing 28,000 monarchs likely were breeding in the winter of 2020. And as I said, it was impossible for an overwintering population of less than 2,000 to then go ahead and reproduce during the summer and produce an overwintering population of more than 247,000. And then moving on, the large overwintering population, 21-22, luckily did not have any major storms or impact on the overwintering population. And so last summer, we had very good. I mean, I hope some of you saw monarchs in Washington last year, because the numbers were much higher than they had been for a very long time, as you can see there on the graphs. And this is data that I've collected personally from email and observations on social media, collecting data. And we had about 9 times as many observations last year than in the previous year. Some of that might be due to the fact that people are using social media platforms more commonly now than they used to, of course, but there definitely was a much bigger population last year. And again, very keen to look at the temperatures during the autumn in California. And again, the temperatures last year during September, October were below the long-term mean. 2020 stands out right up there. At some point, we're going to go back up to there. And so we'll see then if we get a repetition of what happened in 2020. Hopefully, I like to see the overwintering populations in large numbers, so I hope it doesn't happen for a while, but it'd be interesting to see what 2023 brings. But anyway, last year, the numbers, no distraction for the migrants again. And as we heard at the beginning, it was the 4th largest count ever of the overwintering at the overwintering sites in California. So quite remarkable. But then, of course, the winter storms returned. So this is what happened just, January, a couple of months ago. I actually was down there in January and checked some sites that I'd also looked at in November and compared the decline. There's always a decline between November and January, and it's usually about 40%, but I measured about 52% decline, and Xerxes, with a much greater sample of 169 sites, measured a 58% decline. So the storms, and they were severe. In the background here is one of the major overwintering sites, natural bridges where trees were taken down, and these trees are important for shelter. The ocean's just in the back there, and the winds come barreling through. And so, you lose trees, and that's a problem for the overwintering population that year and in future years. So there's no doubt the winter storms did have an impact. And now, just right up to date, the continuing cool, wet conditions in California are not helping the monarchs at all. As I said, they're most vulnerable at this time. The butterflies, leaving the overwintering sites. They've had a long, hard winter. They survived the storms, if they did survive the storms, and milkweed is coming up now. But did they all survive? The weather has not been warm enough for much activity. So there seems to be it seems to be fairly clear that the reproductive potential will not be optimal this right now. I mean, the first generation of breeding monarchs in California, of immatures, should be occurring right now, and it's those that produce the first migrants that migrate up here, and that number may be much smaller than would have been if we didn't have the storms. So a quick summary of all what I've said so far. That so we had, I think the neonicotinoid, the pesticide, reduced the population to around 200,000, and that would appear to be unsustainably low if there are severe winter storms, presumably produced by climate change. And so, that's a problem in the future. We need to get above 200, 300,000. Otherwise, severe winter storms could have a big impact, and we'll see again this year what sort of impact those storms had. And the other takeaway is that migrating monarchs are experiencing warmer autumns and winters in California, but they are adapting by changing what they do, becoming winter reproductive instead. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing, as some people think. So what does this mean for the dynamics in the future? Overwintering populations will be vulnerable and need to adapt to severe winter storms and a warming climate. Some of the overwintering sites are better situated for protection against the winter storm. So, they need to adapt to those better sites, perhaps. I could see those in my survey down there, which were the best ones. And so overwintering in California, the overwintering numbers by the Thanksgiving counts may not be a true indication of what the population is. If, some years, most of them are reproductive. And the ability of monarchs to adapt to changing conditions will be an important driver of future population trends. Okay, so now I'm moving on to a more holistic view. Interrupt, Paulette, if you want me to stop for questions, but I think there's only a few there, so I'll continue on. So I talked a lot about pesticides and climate as being, major population stresses, and hopefully I brought home to you how major they are. And this slide here, the font size indicates how important I think they are. So the next one on the line is habitat, obviously important too. And then there's other things like roadway mortality. That seems to be important in the spring, in my observations, when migrants do fly close to the ground, they're looking for milkweed. And I've seen instances of dead monarchs in the roadway, and the population's pretty low at that time. And so that might be important. Natural enemies, and natural enemies have always been around, will always be around, but sometimes they can be worse than other times. And then there's OE, which is a pathogen. I'm going to talk more about all these things. And lastly there, I've got human interference at a very tiny level, and I'll finish my talk off by talking more about that and how little I think that figures in the holistic view of stress in monarch populations. But firstly, habitat, and we need to look at habitat seasonally, because the monarch has habitat in all the seasons, different habitats usually, so we need to look at them seasonally. The summer habitat here in, a lot of you recognize this slide as Lower Crab Creek, incredible monarch habitat that unfortunately hasn't actually been a monarch habitat for 2 or 3, 4 years, maybe now, I can't remember how many. Even last year in the relatively good year, there were only small numbers there. I was told, I didn't actually see any there myself. And so, habitat in the Pacific Northwest is very different from the East. Milkweed tends to occur more patchily. There's larger gaps between patches, and often the patches are really big, like Lower Crab Creek. And there's a lot of similar patches to Lower Crab Creek, in terms of size in Idaho and elsewhere in Washington too. And they're often associated with riparian areas along creeks and wetter areas. And so that's a feature of our landscape. And so we can get monarchs concentrated in these particular sites. And at Lower Crab Creek, in the good years, we were seeing populations of 300 to 400 butterflies at the one spot, not moving on, residents, which is unheard of in the eastern US. They move around a lot more. So that's a feature of the West. But conservation and creation of monarch habitats in the West, there's a bit of question mark about how important that is. But the more the milkweed, the better. I mean, obviously, milkweed populations have declined over decades, but maybe not to the same extent as in the East. I mean, we don't have as much milkweed as they do anyway, simply for the reasons I've said, that we've got large areas where milkweed can't grow. But so we need to, think about conserving and creating new habitats where there is suitable habitat and no milkweed is growing. And this particularly applies to California, probably more so than Washington and Oregon and Idaho, because that's where, the vulnerability is in the spring. Not only weak females buffeted by storms, but they've got a fine milkweed that's pretty sparse on the landscape down there. There's some species of milkweed that they focus on at this time that are not that common. And so they have a challenge in time actually finding milkweed. So there's a lot of room for improvement there. And there's a lot of work being done to create habitat and to make these spring milkweed species more available to people so they can cultivate it. So and then subject, a favorite of mine, or another part of my day job, I guess, is working in agriculture and advocating for milkweed and monarchs in low input agriculture. I work a lot, as some of you know, in vineyards and low input environment, and we have a program called Beauty with Benefits, which basically is providing native habitat to increase the numbers of beneficial insects, primarily predators and parasites of grapevine pests. But by doing that, we can also provide resources for butterflies. And milkweed is one of the perfect plants to do this, because not only does it attract many beneficial insects, and these are outlined in this paper that I've put on the slide here, but of course it's a host for monarch butterflies. So this is actually a vineyard in southern Oregon where they've taken this to heart, and they're growing milkweed both along the rows and along the side. And they have monarchs turn up there every year, and they don't spray. They don't need to spray. And that's the good thing about grapes. There are very few pests of grapes, and organic management is a definite reality in many grapevines in Washington and Oregon. So that's another area for milkweed establishment in agriculture, and not just in grapevines, but other crops too, in the fullness of time as agriculture develops. Another problem with summer habitats is lack of nectar late in the season. And interestingly, at Crab Creek, and I've mentioned this before, purple loosestrife and Russian olive provide important resources for monarchs. One, Russian olive for shade, and purple loosestrife for nectar. Sometimes it's the only nectar there late in the season. So it's an example of noxious weeds that are not really that noxious in that environment, but they're providing a valuable service for monarch. Then the autumn habitat, we are very fortunate in the West in having rabbit brush. I think without rabbit brush, monarchs would have trouble navigating their way across our landscape, where there's very few nectar resources other than rabbit brush during the autumn. So there's no studies documenting this, but I feel that without rabbit brush, they'd be in far worse trouble. And some recent research showed that a lot of the lipid accumulation and the energy reserves that the monarchs need for overwintering actually accumulates at sites close to nectar resources close to the overwintering site. So the rabbit brush will fuel the migration to get to California, and then once they get to California, they can tank up on people's asters in their garden and whatever, and it's that helps them get through the winter. So this is a little known thing that's from research done in the eastern US, but there's no reason why it wouldn't apply here, which shows the importance of providing nectar in urban areas in California for the migrant population. Winter habitats, the well-known overwintering sites, we need to protect them. A lot of them on private land, of course. We still know very little about the characteristics of overwintering sites and what it is that's important about them for monarchs. This slide shows Pismo Beach from an unusual angle from the beach side. And so you can see it's a wood, it's a forest, a mini forest, if you like. And if you're in the air and looking down, it probably stands out as a forest area. And so, this is one of the biggest overwintering sites in terms of the numbers that it attracts. Even through the bad times, it's always attracted a good number of monarchs. So it's one of the successful sites. And so there's other examples like this, a wooded hilltop type site. But a lot of them are gullies too. And this is an Australian picture where they're mostly gullies, but there's a lot of gullies along this bit of the coastline from Morro Bay to Pismo Beach is further to the south. And the problem with these gullies is that when there's a storm coming in from the Pacific, they just blow the monarchs through the gully because they're oriented east to west usually, and they act as wind tunnels. So these are the vulnerable sites I was talking about. But the mature woodland sites seem to be the better sites in protecting the butterflies from the wind and the bad weather. Roadway mortality, I've already mentioned that. Natural enemies, there's a whole range of natural enemies, a plethora of natural enemies. The estimates of survival from egg to adult in the wild range from 1% to 3%. And we've got predators, parasitoids, parasites, pathogens, you name it. But these are all natural. And every year we seem to find a predator that's feeding on monarchs.
Hi.
Hello. Okay, so, but then in some urban areas, there are some predators that are causing undue problems, or problems that are bigger in certain areas. And one of these is European paper wasp. And this is mostly an urban problem, this wasp. I mean, it occurs in rural areas too, but it seems to have a liking for urban areas. And so you'll get large numbers in places like San Francisco, LA, and they will wipe out caterpillar populations generally, not just monarchs, but all caterpillars. And in that sort of area, in that time, and there's fluctuations in population, so it doesn't happen all the time, but when these wasps are at their height, very few caterpillars can survive. And this picture here shows a European wasp actually, attacking a butterfly before it's even the close from the chrysalis. So they can be a major problem. And then there's the normal things like jumping spiders and stink bugs, even lacewings, which are not very big, as you can see from the caterpillar here. It's managing to suck the juice from a mature or fairly mature caterpillar. So it's quite remarkable, the predators that they have to navigate to get to adulthood. And then there's the parasitoids, which are either wasps or flies that lay their eggs on the caterpillars, and they are eaten from the inside out by maggots. The most predominant one are tachinid flies, and again, these are more common in urban areas, and particularly in the south. And again, they don't affect the entire Western population. We have a few in Washington, but not very many. And so, you'll sometimes get people complaining very loudly about parasites and predators, but usually it's a localized problem. And that's what happens in biological control, because it's another form of biological control, where you'll get, a greater intensity for a short period of time, and then it will back off and then come back again. It's a natural cycling. And another example of a natural cycling is this parasite here that's also brought I like to say undue attention to the monarch. It is a specific parasite for monarch butterflies. It's a parasite with this unpronounceable name, so we call it OE. And these are the spores of OE, and these are the butterfly scales. So you can see how small these spores are. Get really badly infested, and when they can close like this, where they cannot spread their wings. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Pathogens, another adverse mortality that butterflies have to go through, monarchs have to go through, and other butterflies, of course. And then there's unknown diseases. I mean, there's diseases that the monarch has that nobody actually knows what it is. This looks like, if I showed this slide to a monarch expert, they would say, oh, it's OE, it's affected by OE, but it wasn't. There was no OE on this butterfly at all. So there are unknown diseases too. So OE is a natural parasite. It's co-evolved with monarchs over millennia, and it's not in the best interest of parasites to kill their host. So I talked about parasitoids earlier, the tachinids, such like, they're parasitoids and they kill their host. But parasites do not kill their host. So there's a difference there, a subtle difference. And so it's not in the best interest to kill the host. Otherwise, they don't have, they need a host to survive. They can be very detrimental to monarch health under unnatural conditions. So if you're breeding monarchs under bad conditions, unsanitary conditions, or you try to rear monarchs continuously, generation after generation, you will have OE problems. But in natural populations, they seem to have a low to medium impact. And there's many shades of grey, of course. And so it's a natural part of monarch ecology, particularly in subtropical regions like Florida, Hawaii, and Queensland, Australia. And monarch populations still persist in these regions. And sometimes they're very high population densities, and sometimes the OE is high. So you can see this is what happens. The monarch population cycles, and so does OE. So this is a classic cycling of a host and its natural enemy. As I said, it's not in the best interest of the pathogen to kill the monarch. So this is a natural system, and it's always been with the monarch, but for some reason now people are becoming very concerned about the impact of this pathogen on some populations of the monarch, or all populations of the monarch. But we need a more holistic perspective. And there's a lot of excellent research on OE in the eastern US, and I emphasize it's mostly in the east again, and it has, by its volume, created an overemphasis of its importance, I think. I mean, we need to know a lot about it, and we do know a lot about it in the East now, but it doesn't mean to say it's exceptionally important. And we've done very little research on it in Western monarch populations. And we are learning, even though the East and West populations are the same species genetically, there are some some nuances between the two populations in terms of behavior and other factors that are different. And, you know, so we can't just assume that what happens in the East happens in the West. As an example of this is something I did as part of one of my tagging, 1 year of tagging, where I did have some OE affected butterflies that I was rearing for tagging and release. And, you know, the best of us will have OE at some times. And you know, if I'd have listened to what I've been told from the Eastern US, I would not have released any OE infected individuals. But since I believe that OE is part of the natural system, I did release them. And we tracked them, monitored the OE infected and the non-affected, and found little difference in the samples of the two types, and they're very small samples. So this is just a small piece of work that I incorporated in a tagging paper, but it did show that the infected, which is the lot at the top here, versus the non-infected, there was no difference in the terms of the distance they flew when they were found, you know, more than 1,000 kilometers, both groups. So the OE individuals, which, you know, in the East, if you believe the research in the East, they cannot fly as well as or migrate as well as non-infected butterflies. But this group did, and they lived as long in terms of when they were found as the non-infected individuals. So it's just suggestive that maybe OE is not quite such a big deal in the West as it is perhaps in the East. And of course, the migration distances here are less than in the East, so that might be part of it. And then going on from OE, and these two things are inextricably linked, the non-native milkweed and the OE conundrum, I like to call it. And the non-native milkweeds are tropical milkweed and two other milkweeds in the Gomphocarpus genus, which are actually the milkweeds that occur in Australia, that are very common now in California in ornamental situations. They're available ornamentally. They're probably available in Washington too. And most of the, for some reason, it's like my sharing's been paused.
What we're saying is exacerbation of OE.
Okay, I've just got a sign saying it's paused, so I don't know how to unpause it.
At the top, David, you should see resume share. Click your screen again.
Resume share. Oh yeah, that's it. Okay. Oh, now I've got gone back to the beginning.
Oh dear.
And I can't. Now might be a time for questions while I fiddle around with this.
Okay, we can do a few questions. There was some discussion about OE and what it is, and Bob Pyle chimed in graciously and informed us that it's a protozoan. And there's a question about the stability of the overwintering sites. Scott Ellerby mentioned that he visited Fort Ross State Park in the early 70s, and he observed many monarchs there, and wonders if that's a stable overwintering site. And that just prompts a general question about stability.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that site actually, but most of the sites are pretty. Well, the major sites are stable in that they are used year after year, but there is some variation. I mean, that's not always true. In fact, new sites are being found every year. Significant large sites were found this year for the first time. I actually found one, which I assumed was known about, but it turned out that it wasn't. And there was 13,000 monarchs there. So they are, they're not as restricted to the overwintering sites as, the same overwintering sites as some people tend to think. They are, again, adaptable in finding new sites if they have to. I mean, it hasn't been documented, but I think if they turn up an overwintering site that was there previously, they will find another overwintering site. But we should still obviously preserve as many of them as we can. But as I said, a lot of them are on private ground. Okay, I think I'm back to, unless you want to ask me a
Okay, just
question.
one final note. Paul Cherubini chimed in and said that Fort Ross is an autumnal cluster site, the Fort Ross State Park. So perhaps we can discuss some of these specific site issues more at the end of your talk.
Okay.
So go ahead, David.
All right. So the major complaint against tropical milkweed is that it can exacerbate OE because they don't die back in the fall unless freezing occurs. Tropical milkweed, that is, and the other ornamental milkweeds I mentioned. And in coastal South and Central California can remain green through the winter, and that's changing year by year further north too. I mean, that's the case in San Francisco, but also native milkweeds are doing that too. They are persisting longer through the winter as well. And it's not that tropical milkweed has a special affinity for OE. It's just any milkweed, that doesn't die back will allow spores to persist from one season to the next. If a milkweed dies back, then the spores will die on the ground during the winter. But if the plant survives, then they remain viable. So as I said, it tends not to happen on native milkweeds, but that is changing with our changing climate, with native milkweeds not senescing or dying back as quickly as they used to. Someone sent me a picture the other day of narrow-leaved milkweed in early January in San Francisco, still green this year. So that sort of blows this exacerbation of OE argument for tropical milkweed out of the water. So this slide, so because of that, conservation organizations have suggested that we should cut back tropical milkweed in the autumn. And this was fine perhaps when winter breeding wasn't such a common occurrence because, they weren't being utilized by female monarchs at that time. But in 2020, that was very different. And so this is a slide from 2020 where milkweed had been cut back in a community garden along with eggs and caterpillars. This milkweed was literally littered with monarch immature stages. Fortunately, they were rescued by the person that took the picture. But you can see that cutting back now could potentially be a bigger problem or a bigger threat to this butterfly than leaving it there. And also, if it's cut back, it doesn't mean the female monarchs are blind to the presence of the stalks. The stalks still emit the same cues that attract monarch females for laying their eggs. And so you can see in this slide, there are eggs on a cut milkweed stem that the caterpillars have got nothing to feed on when they emerge. So non-native milkweed supporting winter breeding might actually be a good thing right now, now that winter breeding is becoming a bigger thing in some years. And maybe the fact that they were able to utilize tropical milkweed in the winter of 2020 actually was part of the reason the population increased the following year. If they hadn't had tropical milkweed, winter breeding may not have been as successful. And it's also possible that they are playing an increasing role in providing sites for egg laying by overwintered females. I mentioned the difficulty the females have in finding native milkweeds at this time of year. So maybe a lot of them are now utilizing tropical milkweed. So, this raises the question, what is worse for the monarchs, removing the host plants because of the natural parasite, or allowing a natural parasite to coexist with the butterfly, as it has for millennia? So, yeah, I mean, because, and I keep going back to the places where the butterflies have, exist with OE year round. And of course, monarchs, before they developed a migration strategy, originated in subtropical areas where most likely their major host plant or one of their host plants would have been tropical milkweed. So the two have a long, long history together. And the other thing that's sometimes brought up as a reason to not grow tropical milkweed is its presence maybe interferes with the migration of reproductive dormancy of monarchs. And this is very unlikely. And the only evidence for this is one paper that was unfortunately flawed. It didn't contain all the experiments it should, and it was not definitive by any stretch of the imagination. And we know from other work, the physiological work, that the major cues for migration and dormancy are the things I've mentioned before: day length, sun angle at solar noon, and temperature. There could be some influence of host plant condition, but that's very minor compared to the overriding factors that I've mentioned already. And it's important to note, because of the adaptability of monarchs, in places like Australia and elsewhere, encounters of any kind of milkweed during migration has the potential to break reproductive dormancy, as occurred in San Francisco in 2020. But the primary driver of this is the high temperatures they're experiencing, and milkweed being there is part of the equation, of course, but it's probably not the major part. It's the high temperature they experience, because in other years, like the last 2 years, monarchs have flown through San Francisco Bay, probably seen the tropical milkweed, probably stopped to feed on the nectar, and then continued on to the overwintering site. So there's very little evidence to support this notion that tropical milkweed can interfere with the migration and dormancy of monarchs. And the other thing I go back to, and I keep going back to Australia, I'm sorry, but I just have to, is that overwintering monarchs in Australia only overwinter at sites that have milkweed present. You cannot find overwintering sites without milkweed, and milkweed is circled in the bottom of the slide there. And so, that doesn't change their overwintering behavior. They remain as overwintering butterflies. So, that to me tells me all I need to know. And, for a long time, I was the only person preaching this gospel, if you like, but I'm happy to have a couple of other well-respected biologists, not necessarily monarch biologists, but professors of butterfly biology, Hugh Dingle and Art Shapiro, who when asked their views about tropical milkweed, said, wasted effort or hogwash. I quite like hogwash. Wish I was brave enough to say hogwash, but and this was in response to the fact that 4 California counties have now banned sales of tropical milkweed. They're not getting rid of the milkweed that's already there, but you can't go and buy it anymore. You can go to the next county and buy it, mind you, but and also it's just tropical milkweed, not the Gomphocarpus species too. So it really is a regulation that's just a nuisance probably to people that live there. Are not going to do anything. Okay, so moving on, and I'm taking a lot of time here. Do you want a break for questions again, or should I continue on to the bitter end for that?
We've got a couple questions. Let's see. There was a question about milkweed that could be grown in the Puget Sound region, and Paul again chimed in with the speciosa, which I think you're familiar with people using on the west side. Is that right, David?
That's right. Speciosa, as long as it's well-drained soil, is good. But the other one that we can use now is swamp milkweed, because swamp milkweed is now actually a native Washington species. Well, it's been found in Washington in the Okanagan, growing apparently naturally and wild. So, and swamp milkweed is happier with moister, wetter conditions. So you have 2 options there, and even narrow-leaved will work on the west side as well.
Okay, so there's some comment about the milkweed, we can either address it now or wait until later. I know it's 7:30, so I just want to be respectful of your time, David. There's just questions about where the milkweeds occur naturally, and the point that swamp milkweed is not native. And I know that's a question that we've gone around with before, so I'm not sure if we want to do that now.
Yeah, all I know is that it's been found in Washington. So
Okay, all right, well, why don't we go on, and then we can perhaps
Okay.
have this conversation when you're finished.
right. Okay, so the final segment in looking at stresses on the Western monarch population, or things that people claim to stress monarch populations. The final one is human interference. How bad is home rearing for monarchs? This has received a lot of press and a lot of attention in recent years with the decline in population. And at least 3 scientific papers have suggested it is bad, leading to a loss of ability to migrate. But again, and I hate to point out flaws in other people's scientific research, but the papers that did look at this were flawed, in my view, in missing some important aspects. And 2 of these were, in these studies, the ability of monarchs to migrate was only assessed in a laboratory using a piece of equipment called flight mills, where butterflies are tethered and they can fly. They're tethered and they can fly under certain conditions, and so the direction they take is considered, or the amount of time they fly is indicative of whether they're migrating or not. I mean, it can work in some situations, but it's certainly not the best way to assess whether migration is going to occur in the wild. And no attention in these studies was given to the fact that monarchs, newly closed monarchs, can also be sensitive to induction of reproductive dormancy and migration. These studies assumed that induction was occurring during development. And so these butterflies were exposed to, well, they were being reared. So, this is the bad thing, being reared. And they migrate as well as butterflies that were collected from outside. So that ignores the fact that we believe, and my Australian work showed that post-eclosion conditions also affect whether butterflies will migrate or not. So the original papers that caused the furor focused on those things. But fortunately, in 2021, there was a study that was produced that did include post-eclosion environmental influences. And it was fortuitous, because they weren't doing it because they'd read my work or anything, but they were tracking monarchs by using radio transmitters, trying out radio transmitters. And in this, they showed, using the flight mill, that they weren't migrating, or they wouldn't have been migrating. But when they actually released the butterflies and were tracking them by radio transmitters, they were migrating. So, which suggests that, the butterflies, if they were, either the rearing conditions, the captive rearing did not impact the migration tendency, or it did, but they changed their behavior because of the post-eclosion conditions once they were flying, made them become migratory. Whatever the reason, it doesn't really matter, but the fact is that these captive reared monarchs did actually migrate after being captively reared. So I'm very happy that this study was published eventually. And of course, we have the work that I've spoken to you about before, where with, community effort with prisoners and community scientists reared nearly 28,000 monarchs over a long period of time, tagged and released, and we have all the data that now tells us about the migration from the Pacific Northwest. We got a good number recovered. If rearing monarchs was not a good thing, we wouldn't expect 0.62% recovery rate, which is comparable to the recovery rate we get with wild captured monarchs in the east. But we also did wild monarchs tagged in the West as well, not as many, only 1,300 over those years, but we only had one recovery. So if we looked at that, we'd think that our tagged monarchs, were more likely to be found, or they appear to be more likely to be found than the wild reared monarchs. I had no explanation for that at all, but it certainly suggests that captive rearing did not affect the chances of our butterflies being recovered again, and all that work has been documented in the papers, bottom of the slide. So I believe that limited home rearing is fine as long as you use naturally occurring source livestock. You certainly don't import material from another location or a farm or anywhere else. I mean, those things are illegal anyway. You use strict cleanliness and hygiene standards, clean up the frass and keep everything spick and span. And there's preferably you have them exposed to natural lighting and day length change, because those are the cues, as I keep mentioning. Outdoor rearing is probably best, but even indoors okay, as long as they're exposed to natural lighting, they're not continuous lighting or something. But even if you did do that, I suspect that once they're released, they will then get the cues they need to orient and migrate. But erring on the side of caution, we should rear them under as natural conditions as possible. And importantly, don't try to rear multiple generations per season, because you will get disease, including OE and the other pathogens, and so we don't recommend that. And most people don't. They in the Pacific Northwest, you get caterpillars or butterfly lay eggs in the garden, or you'll find some caterpillars and just rear them once, and that's it. I mean, most of the collaborators in my projects do that, and there's no attempt to rear multiple generations, which is when problems could occur. So as long as you do that, I think you're fine. And what are the benefits of rearing? Well, we hear that there's not much conservation benefit from it, and there probably isn't. I mean, it's better to create habitats, reduce pesticide usage, and do all the things that I've talked about previously, rather than trying to rear monarchs for conservation purposes. I mean, I don't think people do that. They do that because they like rearing monarchs. It's something we want to do. I mean, it helps with our research too, because with the tagging program as an example, but more importantly, it's a gateway experience to a lifelong love and commitment to nature. And here I have to thank Bob Pyle, who I think's on the call tonight. The extinction of experience is something that's very close to my heart now, that I really believe in, and he coined this idea back in '75, describing, a way to describe the progressive loss of human and nature interactions, which ultimately will undermine our future support for biodiversity policies. What we grow up being is what we become. I'm an example of that. As you heard, I reared caterpillars as an 8-year-old. So, I'd become the conservationist I am. And so, children touching, collecting, rearing invertebrates is our first and often pivotal contact with the natural world. Things like tadpoles and caterpillars, roly-polies, all those things you find in the garden shape the feelings a child has and will have for the natural world and the little creatures that run it. And now that's even more important, because you've all heard of the so-called insect apocalypse, which it may not be an apocalypse per se, but it certainly, there is a decline going on, and it is essential that we nurture a love and respect for insects in our children, because they are the future, and we'll make the decisions about insects in the future. The bad news is, I hate talking about this, and this is the first presentation I'm actually talking about this explicitly, but in California now, rearing and touching monarchs, even though the population has rebounded to the fourth highest level since monitoring began, it's illegal. You're not allowed to do this. I mean, Annabella here would be breaking the law with having a monarch on her nose. So you might think, oh, we can just ignore that. But no, if you dare touch a monarch, you can expect a visit from armed California Department of Fish and Wildlife officers. And this is not a made-up picture. This is, unfortunately, a picture that was taken by one of my collaborators in the paper I mentioned earlier on winter breeding. These are citizen scientists, just love monarchs. In fact, this lady whose doorbell camera this is that got the picture of these officers coming to the door, she got her love of monarchs from finding one of my tag butterflies, one of the ones that became reproductive in her backyard. And she now, I mean, she's a school teacher. She teaches children about monarchs. She's got a butterfly garden. She used to rear them. She can't now because it's illegal. And this is what happened. This is a sad state of affairs, I think. And maybe, it's something we don't want to see on a broad scale. And so, we've had this 2-year rebound and there's no change. And, government regulations tend not to change, unfortunately. And soon we have consideration of the monarch as a threatened species again in early this time next year. And, I really worry that if that happens, similar regulations could be introduced nationwide. And I believe taking monarchs away from the people is the single worst thing that could happen for future monarch populations. And my slide of different font sizes, I think it will be way up there with climate and pesticides. And now I'll just share briefly the end of this talk. Some slides. I teach insect conservation at WSU to students, to postgrad students, and as part of those lectures, we talk about solutions for how to conserve insects, and a big part of this is human insect well-being intertwining, because they do, engaging society on the value of insects for human well-being is urgently needed. Getting people interested and invested in doing this is essential. If people don't care, then our insect populations are going to disappear. Not talking just about monarchs, but insects generally. So developing appreciation for insects, I think, is extremely important. And it needs better communication. They do have an intrinsic value to us, and things like the monarch are icons and flagship species, so-called, so they will help greatly. So seeing the monarch being a restricted species and do not touch, I think, is just going to be the worst thing that could happen for insect conservation generally. And we must counter the negative perceptions of insects. And, the public is largely unaware of the benefits and services that insects provide. And further from Bob's extension of experience, other authors are now talking about, intergenerational inequities, stealing the joy of benefits of nature from our children, and there are health benefits from nature that are, you look at the literature, they're well documented now. Even spiritual values of nature. I'm sure we all know that feeling, being in the mountains. It's a real thing. And so, taking it away from children and young people or anybody is a big threat to nature, insect conservation, I think. So we all need to become ambassadors. And, and I'm happy to be speaking to this group that I'm part of, because we do that. We do advocate for insect conservation. And it's a powerful means, our outreach for increasing awareness, especially to children. Think the first wild animal a child encounters is likely to be an insect, and these positive early experiences are crucial, I think. So, taking away the rearing experience from a generation of California kids, I think is, thin end of the wedge. So, yeah, I think I'm nearly off my soapbox now. but we must encourage young people to become monarch conservationists. And I think it's critical to continued conservation of monarchs and to insects and pollinators generally. So thank you for listening to this very long holistic talk. I hope I've given you some better appreciation for looking at the bigger picture. And I want to thank everybody that's helped me work on monarchs in the last 2 decades. Everybody listed down there, including Bob, and particularly Bob for his for everything that he's done and written over the past 20 years too, and before that, of course. Thank you, everybody, and to Wobber as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. This is a wonderful, wonderful update. A lot of new information since last year, so appreciate your bringing us up to speed. This is a time where everybody can unmute and chime in. There are a couple questions about the situation in California and specifically whether that's a statewide Fish and Wildlife directive about not touching monarchs, and what the situation is in Washington as well. I think you have had some issues with not raising and releasing monarchs. And so could you just talk briefly about that, David?
Yes, it is a statewide thing in California, unlike the milkweed ban, which is just different counties. But yeah, Fish and Wildlife is a statewide ban. In Washington, they refused to give out permits last year for tagging monarchs. They haven't broadcast in any way that touching monarchs is illegal in Washington. I think they were just piggybacking on the California regulation, but I haven't sought clarification. I was just very annoyed that they didn't allow me to even apply for a permit last year. And I guess I'll try again this year and see what they say, but it's unclear as to what they're doing. Oregon, in contrast, and Idaho have no regulations at this point, and don't seem to be thinking about introducing any, I hope.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's see, there was a question about the introduction of monarchs to Australia and Hawaii. Paul Cherubini, you mentioned something. Are you willing to unmute? And you had a date that you put forward. Paul, are you willing to unmute?
Yes.
So you said that monarchs were introduced 175 years ago to Australia, Hawaii?
Yeah, around 1850.
So I guess that raises the issue about co-evolution of OA and monarchs. And so I don't know if that's something you want to talk about, David.
Sorry, co-evolution of what in monarchs?
OE?
Oh, right. Yeah. Well, I mean, OE does affect, OE is associated with monarchs in Australia too. So presumably OE traveled with the monarchs to Australia. Interesting point. I hadn't really thought about that. But, monarchs arrived in Australia allegedly, hopping from island to island, Hawaii, down through the Pacific. There's a timeline there where you can see where different occurrences at different times. So yeah, presumably they entered Australia with some proportion of the population with OE already, or maybe it was there already. We don't know everything about OE. It does seem to be confined to Danaid butterflies, the genus, the same genus as monarchs. So there may be some other species that have OE as well. In fact, I think there are some other Danish species that do have it in Australia. So it may have been there already, but we don't know.
Okay, everybody is free to chime in. I'm just kind of filling in comments and things that people have made, but please feel free to unmute yourself, ask questions, make comments. Please feel free. There was, I mean, this gets back to the question of whether it's good to plant milkweed or not. And I think Bob Pyle had a good point that basically it doesn't hurt that here in Western Washington, we're not likely to see monarchs no matter how much milkweed there is, not anytime soon anyway, but that it's a great pollinator plant. And so do you want to comment on that, David?
Yes, certainly. I missed that point. Actually, I meant to make that. It's, you know, the paper that I mentioned where I was advocating milkweed in viticulture was based on the fact that it attracts an enormous diversity of insects, pollinators, and predators and parasitoids. So yeah, and when people want to grow milkweed because they're thinking about monarchs, I tell them that it's not just for monarchs, it's for pollinators generally and other butterflies and other beneficial insects. It really is a key plant for those things. So yeah, there's a lot of good about milkweed apart from being a host for monarchs.
Yeah, I think one of the issues is since it's non-native, you know, should we be planting non-natives? I mean, it's a complicated question, and it seems like there probably aren't. Well, there aren't any native milkweeds on the west side. So I mean, I think that is an issue that some people have about whether it's okay to plant non-natives.
May I speak to that?
Yes, please do. Please,
I've
every
got a-
discussion.
I've got a new laptop over here in Astoria and I don't have a camera.
Okay.
Well, it's a complicated question in a way, but we plant any number of non-native plants, of course, and some of them we know have enormous value to our butterflies. For example, the purple loosestrife we do not encourage, and yet I don't think the Eastern Washington migration would have anything like the legs it does, as David has pointed out, without the purple loosestrife, which is what one very largely sees it nectaring on along the Columbia. But as far as the milkweed goes, Paul Cherubini pointed out that Speciosa, the showy milkweed, has been found on the west side, and indeed it has. John Pelham found it in the railroad yards many years ago. My hypothesis is that it came in on the trains, but there's some there from time to time. And, you know, it was almost certainly on the west side, probably both species, that and the narrow-leaved, earlier warmer times. We'll probably be back again in future times. I don't have any problem with finding those or the swamp milkweed. Anything that'll grow here and help the pollinators and not invade more native dominated habitats is fine with me. I don't think they will. I don't think any of the Asclepias on the west side are going to be any threat to non-native habitats. I wanted to say that I'm glad Paul's with us tonight. Paul Cherubini, if you don't know, has got one of the longest, most distinguished histories of monarch research in California. He's done an enormous amount of basic research in monarchs for over half a century, and we thank him for that. Paul, I bet will agree with us that this business of the no-touch policy in California is absolutely appalling. It's one of the worst pieces of state regulation I have ever seen in my life. It's exactly contrary to Richard Louve's entire thinking about the last child in the woods and saving our children from nature deficit disorder. There's no better tool against nature deficit disorder than a butterfly net, and getting kids together with insects. And touch is part of that, and to learn more about them, we need to interact with them. David put it very, very well. And by the way, David, splendid talk, and thank you so much for your very kind words. I do appreciate that. But I think most of us be of one accord that that's a rotten, regressive, and totally misled bit of regulation that I very much hope we can get around. And if the butterfly does get listed, which I've supported on certain grounds and not others, I don't know, be a strange kettle of fish. I don't think it'll happen. But if those regulations were to go nationwide, I mean, David said it, thin edge of the wedge and worse. I
Well,
don't
since
think-
you have some experience with this policy being in California, do you have some comments about that?
My impression is the Xerxes Society is behind the regulation.
No, that's not correct, Paul. Xerxes, I think Xerxes was promoting not rearing very much.
Right.
Oh, I disagreed on that. I made my feelings clear with them. I think that was misled as well. You're quite right on that. I don't believe that Xerxes has been involved in the no-touch business. I think that was homegrown on the part. You know how legislators go overboard and regulators can go overboard. We all know that sometimes you get an idea. In fact, we used to see that a lot with the morphos that were supplied for jewelry and trays and things, the beautiful tropical morphos in trade. And people would say, we got to save them. We got to not collect them. Well, it was all males anyway. Collecting wasn't affecting their population. And not only that, but as they banned collecting of morphos, you see what's happened to the neotropical forests in the meantime. It's habitat. It's habitat. Personal human impacts on insects, other than with chemicals, have been almost negligible, certainly with the butterfly net, which is the least effective device for reducing insect populations since the fly swatter. So you're right, Paul. I think Xerxes was on the wrong end of the stick on that, in terms of not rearing, not tagging. And I hope they've got over that. But I don't think they were behind the don't touch. Xerxes promotes a great deal of good scientific research that's very much touch and sample based.
Any other comments, questions, discussion?
Well, I'll put my 2 cents in here, which may or may
Please
not
do.
actually have anything to do with what happened in California, but you hear people in Washington talk about how we need a full-time legislature because our legislature does not have time to get everything done. California has a full-time legislature and they do all kinds of crazy things because they want to stay in Sacramento. They don't want to go back home, wherever it is that they were elected from. So all kinds of weird stuff goes on just because they do have a full-time legislature. Don't support a full-time legislature for Washington. Our part-time legislature is good enough.
Well, I have a question for David. I guess I was wondering about the potential for adaptation to neonicotinoids. Yeah, let's see. Do you expect a stable population I mean, let's see. So neonicotinoid use is increasing, but do you think there's any possibility? I mean, it seems like the population has been stable for a while. Do you expect it to decrease, or do you expect it to continue stable?
It's a good point. I mean, all insects adapt and develop resistance to chemicals. So that could be happening. That could well be happening. But you know, we've got new chemical. There's new neonicotinoids coming on the market all the time. So new classes of chemicals as well. But yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we're talking about sublethal doses, so there could be some adaptation resistance happening within the population. For sure.
So what are the obstacles to reducing neonic use?
Well, I mean, one thing I didn't mention is that, you know, neonicotinoids are banned in Europe. They have been since 2018.
Right.
So they're not available for use outdoors there anywhere except very special situations. There's no indication that we are taking that route at all. As far as I can tell, there's some local restrictions on certain types of compounds, but not across the whole class. So yeah, I don't know. I'm surprised more of an upswelling of public opinion about them. I think it'll happen at some point, but I'm surprised it hasn't happened already. Yeah, I mean, I see nothing that suggests that they're going to go away or be reduced anytime soon.
It seems like if, I mean, well, there's only been a few years, but it seems like at some point there could be a difference between Europe and the United States as far as insect populations, and it seems like that would come to light.
Yes, that's what I've been waiting for. And I saw one of the first papers published on that last week, I think it was, and that it was surprising in that it's a paper on the birds, I think, and detecting residues in birds, and there was still detecting residues in birds, even though neonics had been banned for 3 years. And so they were pointing to that as evidence that it was more long-lived in the environment than perhaps realized. They were still feeding on grain residues, even though the chemicals hadn't been used for 2 to 3 years. So it's not going to immediately, go from being bad to being good. It's going to be a gradual transition, I think. So, the longer we use them, the longer that period will be in the future, no doubt.
David, did I hear you say that neonics cannot be filtered out of our drinking water?
Yes, you did hear me say that. Yeah.
It's kind of frightening.
Yeah. They're in treated water as well as untreated water.
Oh my. There's a good question from Marilyn Egler. Do you want to unmute Marilyn and we can discuss this? And she's asking what brands contain neonics. I mean, I think it's a good question. How do you discern if you're trying to manage, a problem? How are they identified on products, or how do we know where they are?
You have to look at the fine details on the labels. There's 7 neonicotinoids, I think, currently used in the US. So you'd have to look them up and then look for those names on the label.
So are they all called neonicotinoids? Or
no, sorry, that word's not used at all, probably. I mean, there's a trade name, which could be anything. And then in the fine print, the active ingredient will show the neonicotinoid insecticide that's being used in that product. And so imidacloprid is one that I mentioned, clothianidin is another one, and there's others, there's another 5. And so you'd have to become familiar with those. You can do that online, you can find them and then look for those. I mean, that's a good point, actually, because, home gardeners just go and pick, what they find on the shelves for the problem they want to treat. And, most of those things do contain neonicotinoids, but you wouldn't know unless you were familiar with the chemicals involved. So that's a good question. And I mean, that wasn't within
I would be happy to do something about this in the GNOME newsletter.
Okay.
I remember writing something about the same topic for the Rose Society newsletter, because an awful lot of home garden insecticides are really bad for beneficial insects, even when they say they're safe, like horticultural oil and the insecticidal soaps. They're horrible for beneficial insects. So we can run something in the GNOME that will help people.
That sounds like a great idea, Regina. And what I'm thinking too is maybe I mean, I don't know how people feel about it. We can take a poll here. Let me know through chat or just speak up. Maybe a whole talk on neonicotinoids might be a useful thing. What do people think?
One of the issues is monarchs are really abundant in the areas where neonicotinoids are used the most, like the state of Iowa. Probably half or more of the entire landscape of the state is treated with neonicotinoids every year, and that's where you see large numbers of monarchs every summer. So the farmers are kind of saying, are you really sure that these chemicals are hurting monarchs?
Well, I think that's a good point. I mean, one of the questions that I would have is why were they banned in Europe? You know, was it just arbitrary, or was there some research that it was based on, or?
Yeah, it was the weight of evidence from studies on pollinators generally that convinced the legislatures there to act. And actually, I read a paper on that recently that was just dissecting the whole reason why it happened, because it doesn't usually happen that the regulatory authorities actually agree with the science at all. I mean, there's many instances where it doesn't happen. And so they were trying to work out why it happened in this instance. And they were pointing to the fact that there was a couple of very high profile papers that got a lot of publicity. And maybe, you know, online social media type forum thing helped in getting the message across. But whatever happened, I mean, it made me think of why it's not happening here. You know, it happened there. You know, I think it was the French Parliament that acted on it first, but then all governments in Europe did, or the European community did anyway. So it was a very unusual situation in how it happened, but it was based on scientific research, overwhelming in showing the sublethal impacts of the class of chemicals. And that was the other thing that was different. Usually it's just a single insecticide that's held up as being a problem. But in this case, the regulatory authorities agreed that it was the whole group of chemicals that was the issue, which the research had shown it was. But yeah, they're still puzzling over why it was so successful.
Yeah, I can see the point, though. If there's plenty of monarchs in Iowa and they're you know, spraying their fields with these pesticides, you know, the question would be, you know, for the user, well, I don't see really a problem. So I can see where that's a challenge. So there's Sego, you put some things in the chat about legislation that's that you see pending. It sounds like you're very involved in that. Can you comment on that? I assume it's for Washington State. Is that right? Can you unmute and talk about it?
Yeah, working on it. Can you see me now?
Yeah, can.
Yeah, because I'm projecting on a big screen, so I didn't know how that would work.
Yep.
Yeah, nothing in particular on this specific subject, but I was just raising an objection to the idea that short sessions result in good legislation, because I've just watched a lot of legislation die over 32 years, all on the excuse of lack of time to get to it. So, you know, the European example of producer responsibility for all packaging has nothing to do with butterflies, but that just died again in Washington State, lack of time to get to it. So a lot of issues that I think are important to a lot of us die from lack of time. So I'm not suggesting a longer legislative session, but I wouldn't suggest that a longer legislative session would create stupid legislation. So that's all the point that I was making.
Okay, thank you. I just thought it might have something to do with pollinators, but the general point is taken, certainly. Okay, any other questions, comments? 2 cents worth? Please feel free to unmute if you have a comment. Okay, well, thank you so much. It was a great presentation. There are a lot of good comments in the chat, a lot of praise for the presentation tonight. So thank you very much, David. We really appreciate your sharing with us your you know, career's worth of experience with Monarchs, and especially the last year, since it's changed so much from the prior year. So thank you for that, and we'll look forward to hearing from you again next autumn.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, everybody. Let's see, one new message. Okay, just lots of thanks. So we'll meet again next month on May 3rd, and working on a presentation right now, maybe Oregon Silver Spot, or it may be something else. We're just trying to finalize that right now. And then that will be our final presentation, and then we'll have our field season and then resume in September in the fall again, first Wednesday of every month. Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, David. Really appreciate your giving this presentation.
Paulette, could I say one thing?
Yes.
Just regarding the field trips, David is going to be leading 2 trips in June, and maybe a longer one, but one is he's calling it a Monarch Weekend. And so I just wanted to let everybody know about that. Information is on our website, and we have a trip coming up in the Hoodsport area at the end of April, and then the next one will be mid-May. But given our temperature, everything may be pushed forward a couple of weeks. But I just wanted to let you know that there's lots of good things. So take a look at the website.
Okay, thank you for bringing that up, Melanie. That's a really good point. I know David is leading a number of trips this field season, so check our website. And the trips, it's going to be a little bit of an unusual situation. We're going to have flash trips rather than specific dates. Do you want to speak to that, Melanie, briefly?
Yes, if you see next to the field trip TBD, it means to be determined. Go ahead and sign up for the trip. And again, depending on the weather, the timing, you'll be informed about the specific time for the trip as as the season progresses. Some of the trips have firm dates, but a lot of them this year are TBD. So
Yeah, I've got a trip that I'm hoping to lead to Mima Mounds that I was theorizing might be mid-May. It still might be mid-May, but it's still winter on the prairie, definitely. It's very cold out there. I was working at Mima Mounds today, and I could see that it was snowing on Capitol Peak, which is right next to Mima Mounds. I mean, yes, it's 2,600 feet, but still. It is still winter on the prairie, so mid-May might be too optimistic.
And I have one listed for the Hoodsport area toward the end of the month, and that one is probably going to be later too. This time last year, I was seeing, I'm calling it an elfin quest, and this time last year, I was seeing three elfins over there. I think it was around the 7th of April, and then anyway, they're not going to be flying by the 7th.
Well, last year was a late spring too. David was talking before his presentation about how little he's seen already this spring. It's just another late spring. Do you want to comment on that, David?
Yeah, it's shaping up pretty much like last year, I think. Just waiting for the snow next week.
I read years ago that a few years back that our portion of climate change here in the Maritime Northwest was likely to be longer, colder, wetter, late winters and springs. And by gum, has that come true?
Yeah.
I don't remember a good butterfly spring in Southwest Washington since 2016. There have been some days, some earlier emergencies, but this is the worst yet, I think. I'm getting really tired of it.
Yeah, last year we were talking about how the butterflies did start to emerge late, and then there was the snow in April, and so then they were all buried under the snow. And so, but David pointed out that they rebounded pretty quickly. So.
Oh yeah, they will eventually, but in the meantime, we've had a few of the early spring geometrid moths, the Encoria lacteata and the Mesoluca gratulata, nectaring on the early spirea, and the plants are there. A certain amount of nectar and so on has come out, but I haven't seen a spring azure. This is one of the latest times not to have seen an echo azure by now. And it just goes on. We've had snow in Grays River 3 mornings this week. I mean, not enough to last. It's crazy.
Yeah, it is a crazy year. Well, I put the address for our website in the chat down there at the very bottom now. So if when we are able to start having field trips again, and I think that was a wise choice this year to do the TBD dates, then if you sign up with a trip leader, then you will get a message about the specific date. So we are going to have field trips, but it's just going to be a little bit different format to respond to the late spring that we're having.
Wonderful talk, David. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you all for listening.
Okay, so good night, everybody. We'll see you next month then. Thanks again, David.
All right.
David. Thank you, David.
This is
Thank you.
Thank you.